Ladies and gentlemen, we have the next speaker. Djembe is a local name for an African drum. The drums were a traditional communication tool in Africa. Djembe is also the name for Mitch's Africa specialized communication enterprise with 5 offices on the continent. Mitch has over 30 years of international financial and corporate communications experience gained in Africa, Middle East, North America and Asia. In 2017, Mitch was named the PR Professional of the Year for Africa at the African Excellence Awards. He is here today. Mitch talks about communication in Africa. Please.
Thank you, Stefan, for that introduction, and also thank you for allowing me to participate here today in a event that in a region that I'm very, very passionate about. So today I want to talk more about approach to communications and the best way to nurture your reputation than the actual tactical applications of a marketing communications program, as I believe it is much more fundamental to being successful in Africa. Many years ago, when I first started building communication strategy in the region, the popular refrain was Africa Rising. I think it came from an Economist story which was on the front page. And this narrative was powerful, and everybody inspired by opportunity and profit really bought into it. The African firms, multinationals, African NGOs, media from across the region and beyond really celebrated this story. It's catchy if you think about it. Africa Rising is incredibly compelling, almost visually. You can see this phrase. And of course, investors loved it. In my few minutes now, in addition to celebrating the very real opportunities across the region, I want to throw a tiny bit of shade on what can happen to an exciting narrative in an increasingly uncertain world. I also want to highlight the promise that the region can be realized by adopting a more inclusive mindset. The region is still fragile, as we all know, and it's still more vulnerable to being knocked off course than any other part of the world. And anybody who has spent time in Africa knows this is a simple fact. And yet, everybody who spends time in Africa, really, Africa gets under your blood for one simple fact, because there's so many incredible opportunities and there's so many incredible people that live in the region. But for us, it's really about responsibility. We can better understand the nature of these opportunities and the risk involved in Africa if we understand that if Africa fails, we fail. So we have a responsibility to ourselves as investors, as business leaders, to our stakeholders, and most importantly, to the communities where you have operations. Because if we have the opportunity and we choose to grasp it, we can create a buffer, a reputational buffer that enables us all to fare better during good times and bad while creating a lasting positive impact in Africa. This means creating strong relationships built on impact investing from a time and money perspective, because it's not just about having the money and having the business plan. As we all know, there's a lot of dry capital that's waiting to get into Africa. You really need to spend the time to understand the region and why these opportunities exist. It also means that you have to be ready for the next crisis. Our industries and the value chain that support them will be much more resilient, sustainable, and healthier if we make this investment today. The 2004 oil crisis illustrated why the African Rising narrative was at best premature and shallow in understanding, and at worst patronizing. Africa was rising, but for who? It's all about leaving a positive impact, because whilst hundreds of billions of dollars in Africa from oil and commodity sales was made, poverty and life chances remained almost embarrassingly unchanged for the ordinary African. And this is a situation that simply cannot exist. Yes, of course, there was great progress in some countries, but the most of the economic dividend from the commodity prices did not deliver for the ordinary person in the long run. When the bad times hit, the foreign firms moved out as well. The question is, did they leave a lasting social impact? For example, did foreign firms invest in local communities, the local people? Perhaps some did. Many didn't. And these that moved out, taking their money and African resources with them, left a very bitter taste in the ordinary African's mouth. By adopting a more socially minded approach to investing in how you conduct your business operations, you will greatly enhance your reputation capital, which is extremely important. These efforts must be authentic, though. They cannot be about just writing checks. As a previous speaker just alluded to, it has to be a number of different perspectives coming together, identifying what the real challenges are in the region, and working together. Because when we work together, you build equity in the future of these communities, and everybody wins. Investing in Africa, opening a branch in Africa, whatever the case may be, you must take your commitment to the region and its people seriously. This means investing in a mode of operations that is, if not purely altruistic, it's more responsible, sustainable, and measurable. In simple terms, the way forward is to adopt a more social approach that is supported by investing in communities once again. This will serve to build your reputation amongst all your stakeholders. And I know from experience that most important stakeholders are the ordinary people who buy your products, who live in the communities where you operate, and also who work in the offices that you have in the region. And in my many years of working in Africa, working for all sorts of type of investment opportunities and companies, I know that investors and businesses are always willing to invest in these amazing opportunities, but not always in the communities and where they operate. And this is very, very short-sighted, because by doing so, you build a strong reputation that will allow you once again to weather the tough times and really be seen as a partner for the region. Because when things go wrong, a lot of times foreign entities are the first ones to be hit, and they're the first ones to disappear. And you lose a lot in terms of your investment capital that you've put into these projects. I think years ago, when I was first working in the region, close to 30 years ago, one of my clients was a managing director for a management consulting firm, and he told me to think about the project differently. He said, you need to think about it differently, you need to look at the communications differently. And he summed it up in a very simple phrase, which I sometimes live to, but he said, you need to think globally but drink locally. You need to really, really look at the region, and you need to understand this region. This region needs to get to you, because if this region doesn't get to you, you don't belong here. And that's how we believe that communications can play a role. Because doing the right thing is all about creating a virtuous cycle, and we all know this from our own experience. And it starts from the ground up, from day one of setting up in a business in the region. Who do we hire? Where are the skills gaps? I know the worst way to start in Africa is to parachute in foreign workers to do the job. That is simply not going to work in the longer term. Building a powerful, responsible, and impactful relationship with stakeholders in Africa cannot happen by parachuting foreigners into the region. Foreign companies setting up shop should be prepared to also decentralize. The HQ approach is patronizing and sometimes can miss the point and completely miss the opportunity at hand. Because why are we in Africa if we're not there to be the best? Why control from London, Dubai, Joburg, or various other markets when you can let go and cultivate and empower talented leaders in Africa? While you need boots on the ground, you also need local knowledge and a strong understanding, as this will drive greater results. Not just because it's patently the right thing to do, but because who is going to actually know what cultural levers to pull at the right point? What can you do a better job of building a business in Africa than a talented African? Who can do a better job? It's about shifting the mindset away from the attitude that we in the Western world know best. What works in the West works in Africa. It simply is not the case, as we all know in this room. And of course, when it comes to training local workers or applying generally accepted best practices, we must work as a coach and not as a boss, because there is a boss mentality in the region, and we must move away from that. Perhaps this sounds patronizing, and I'll explain why it's not patronizing. The very best approach to building a reputation in Africa contribute to building a sustainable supply chain that can be done in a non-patronizing way when its local office MD is building the business and training the local hires. When it is the local team that is negotiating with customers, suppliers, and partners, your company stops being seen as a foreign import. It gains credibility through authenticity, something that we at Djembe know all too well, as Stefan referenced earlier. We have found to be a critical element to our success is that we start first and foremost from an African perspective, an African insight. We call it the djembe difference. As you heard, the djembe is not just a drum. A successful djembe drummer actually tells a story. And that's what we believe we do, and we do well. And we also believe that this type of local insight, this type of local knowledge in the communications industry is short. That's why we adopted this different approach of building our business. And we did so from day one. Because with the best will in the world, somebody from Detroit, an expat from Detroit, is never going to understand Africa as deeply, passionately, and realistically as my African colleagues. I let them train me. I let them coach me. I've worked in that region for over 25 years and been there hundreds of times. I know the region well. I love its extraordinary variety and highly specific cultural nuances that continue to thrill me today. But I can never garner the credibility or the natural authenticity that a local can. I learned early on to respect my African colleagues' point of view and to trust that point of view. Because that's a very, very important distinction. It's one thing to accept, but it's also to trust your African colleagues' point of view. So we must let go sometimes from our own experiences. We must invest in local knowledge and create a communications approach that is built on insight and deep understanding from the local perspective first and foremost, as I keep saying. Whether in Ghana or Niger, I know that the African spirit of entrepreneurship and extraordinary hard work is alive and kicking today. As investors and business leaders, you should capitalize on this spirit, just as we have done successfully at Djembe. We did this once again by building a pan-communications consultancy from the grassroots up. We did it by empowering homemade teams to do what they do best. That's allowed them to flourish as individuals and as a team, and provided Djembe with an unparalleled rich bank of local knowledge, once again, that is lacking in the communications field. Personally, I've always been drawn to entrepreneurs and risk takers. Maybe that's why I love this region so much. And I've had so much faith in the people who are delivering amazing results within the Djembe network. This approach has allowed Djembe to target audiences from a completely different but a much stronger perspective. For example, we have leaning on innovation and enterprise, that is the African board, has allowed Djembe to reach greater audiences in a manner that our clients can gain from these stronger relationships. Through our work, we understand the difference across the region. We place a major importance on policymakers and governments because it allows us to have a greater impact. But the African reality is that working with governments and policymakers also comes with risk. Political uncertainty in some countries and corruption in others makes your investment risk higher. But we can ride out the political shocks if we do our groundwork, as I've mentioned previously. This popular narrative, Africa rising, soon fell apart when the world realized that only parts of Africa had risen, and it wasn't the poor who had risen necessarily from poverty. But the fundamental truths remain. Africa has a massive demographic dividend, hundreds of millions of young, tech-savvy people. So much potential exists, as you all know. Africa continues to be on the receiving of an FDI that is transforming many sectors, but much more needs to be done. And there are huge investment opportunities in high-growth sectors that can make and leave behind a positive legacy. Because when investors and businesses support the key growth projects, schools and universities, this support has meaningful impact. It contributes to socioeconomic growth. And you cannot uneducate a population when the commodity prices plummet. You can't easily break down the fundamentals of a healthy local supply chain and skill force just because global growth has slowed. If a company wants to benefit from massive potential that this region offers, then they must accept the reality to make a difference requires you sometimes to take a step back and let it happen. Whether Africa is rising, thriving, flourishing, or evolving, the buzzword is irrelevant. Africa is tough, complex, fascinating, and not always for the faint-hearted. But for those who adopt a more inclusive approach to the region, it is one of the most exciting places to operate and thrive. Thank you very much.